that. So Andrew, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Excellent. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person today. You've had some great presentations and great discussions, so I really missed something there. But yeah, I think one of Toby's ideas was to do some, I don't know, policy briefs, policy notes, and try and feed them into different discussion, different policy making fora over the next few months, to try and get what we might call a better discussion going on many of the issues that we've been talking about. So I just went through my notes on all the discussions and came up with 6 possible suggestions for some kind of output from this excellent conference. So the first one, and of course, you may have completely different ideas. I mean, these are just suggestions. I mean, you may have different ideas. You may think that one of them is important, but not the others, etc., etc. So the first one is the need for some kind of proper study of lockdowns. And we've heard, that there are different variants of lockdowns. And the background to this is that the social contract has been potentially significantly harmed in many settings. So the elites don't care about the rest. The global 17% who work from home, however we want to define it, don't care about the rest. So one question I had for you was, could we even think about designing, at least in terms of the bare skeleton, could we think about designing a study or a set of studies focused on lockdowns? So this is one. The second one is that we've heard a certain amount about alternative models for managing the COVID-19 pandemic, and these need air. They have been criticized and stifled out of discussion. The alternative models like Nicaragua, Sweden, Tanzania, these need some legitimacy and some air in the public discourse on pandemic management. And I think we can discuss how best to do this. It may be that we don't produce an output on that specifically, or that we produce an output on Nicaragua, as a short output for policymakers on Nicaragua. The third idea is the question about United Nations organizations, and in particular perhaps the WHO, UNESCO, and UNICEF, and are they fit for purpose? What has the pandemic told us about their fitness for purpose? Why did the WHO override its own guidelines? Why are decisions not taken in favor of the global majority, but they were taken in favor of a minority of the global minority, I suppose? And with UNESCO and UNICEF, why did they fail to campaign for nursery and primary school reopening much earlier when the evidence was available? And I'm also wondering, as part of the background to that, why did the UN not have more of a discussion amongst its agencies? What kind of UN governance system exists? And how did it work in this case? Was there any debate? Or was it all closed down very early on? So something about the WHO being fit for purpose, and perhaps slightly broader than that, are the UN agencies and the UN system. The fourth one, what does pandemic preparedness need to consider? So, the WHO and its member states are busy designing a treaty on pandemic preparedness, which member states would then sign up to. I've seen the current draft. It's very much the kind of document that you would expect. And it does not take into account so many, 90% of the issues that have been exercising us in the conference that we've had. For example, pandemic preparedness needs to think about neglected but predictable harms like food insecurity, reverse migration, child mental health issues. It needs to think about risks and make it a norm that risks are thought about in a disaggregated way, that data is prepared and presented in a disaggregated way. If necessary, the modelers and statisticians might need to, some of them might need a bit of training on that, I don't know. But I suspect rather it's a question of establishing norms about disaggregated data. And then policy responses also need to be disaggregated by geography and by social groups, categories. We also need to think of a pandemic as, in the global south, as one of many crises, and keep it in perspective, in proportion. And related to all this, the need to develop inclusive public health communications, which I think was a feature of some of our discussion. So, we should try and influence this pandemic preparedness treaty in one way or another. And I'm also intrigued by what Sundar was saying about, the World Bank getting on with loans for post-pandemic preparedness, and how does that relate to all this? So that's number 4. Number 5, how to get greater priority for children in global and national decisions. And we might ask the same. I think this is very evident in the whole discourse about school closures and the failure to reopen schools and the failure to think about the harms done to children and so on. And we might ask similar questions about the informally employed or self-employed, mostly poor people, near poor people, often women. And these are massive groups. If we add those 3 groups together, that's your kind of a large part of your global majority, which has been neglected during the pandemic. And then a 6th issue, I'm not sure this is really one issue, but it's a kind of bundle of issues about institutions. So we had an interesting discussion which seemed to lead to a tentative conclusion that regimes and policy responses are not particularly well correlated, which I found, very interesting and in a way encouraging. It means that I suppose there are lots of other factors that come into determining the policy responses to a shock like a pandemic. Another institutional issue that has surfaced several times during our discussions is that the same institutional arrangements can work well or badly in different contexts. And I'm thinking here of the interministerial committees, which were perhaps successful in Nicaragua or Cambodia, but not effective in Guinea-Bissau. And I think maybe another context, was it Burundi, was also mentioned. And we've also had a little bit of discussion about centralized versus community-based health service provision. That's a bundle of issues, and we may feel that we should focus on one of them, or we should focus on none of them, or I'm not quite sure what. And something else we might discuss. I was really impressed by the story of the campaign launched by our 3 participants in Turkey. And I wondered, if going further forwards, once we have perhaps a bit more evidence about lockdowns, how we might organize, we could think about how we might organize a campaign against hard lockdowns or curfews, if there is a risk that these are going to be the major or a major response to pandemics in the long term or in the medium term. So I think learning from that account of the campaign in Turkey, perhaps to a more global level on the lockdown issue, might be a good idea. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was really made us, I think, really brought together a lot of the themes. And can I just ask you a question? A lot of people have been scribbling some notes, but would you mind if we put the email in which you sort of distilled that onto the screen later, so that people can see that? Would that be okay?
Of course it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
It's not a question, it's just a small point on the risk factor. Yes, if could be included as well the identification of vulnerability, but not just like something static at the beginning, that's it, something that need to be done throughout, because I think that something has failed in this case. Analysis from beginning, but throughout as well, because as we have seen, many examples has changed along the pandemic.
So also because we are from different countries and different disciplines, it'll be good to sort of create a set of indices or parameters to start with how we will operationalize vulnerability. So even if it's we've been discussing both qualitative and quantitative data, so we can actually create a set of things like Kevin had some of that on his slides. how will we define what are the things that we are measuring and so on, and that'll be something good. Since I have the mic, I am very sneaky. I have attended a lot of conferences. Couple of things about the international agencies and so on. When you said what Andrew referred to as whether they're fit for purpose. So two things, particularly with the WHO pandemic treaty. My understanding is, please correct me. I hope I'm wrong. Delegates from different countries could actually sign off on the treaty, and that was then binding on the countries. If I'm wrong, that's great. If I'm not, then we need to do something about that process, because there are two kinds of processes involved here. One is what happens at the WHO. The other thing is what happens in a country like, say, India. So if there is a bill that has to be, is brought into the parliament, then there's a parliamentary standing committee which also looks at it and talks about it, but also the parliamentary standing committee has a responsibility to hold public hearings on that issue and invite civil society organizations, other stakeholders, citizens to comment on it. Now, none of that process happened with the WHO pandemic treaty. This is not the first time. For 20 years, we have we have bypassed democratic processes. So there is that history that we have to deal with. But when something like the pandemic treaty happens, then we need to build pressure also on these international forums and agencies. If, like Van said in the morning, UN is supposed to protect us from hell, it has to make sure that it upholds some of these democratic principles itself. How did the WHO decide that it was okay to have a procedure like this? And related to this is transparency in funding. So who is donating to various or arms of the UN and to the WHO, and how do the general public find out about it? And what does that have to do with the decisions that are taken? So transparency in decision-making processes at the level of the agency, internal decision-making within countries, and transparency in funding.
Well, I heard contextualization as one of the themes that Andrew identified, but I think it needs to be a cross-cutting issue. I mean, I work on international comparative analysis of health systems. This is what I teach at the university to master's students. And one of the first things I teach them, and I think you all know, context is everything. So, and what we have been hearing over and over again here is that this contextualization of COVID, the risks, the harms, all of these were quite missed. And what we also hear is that the regime and the power relationships played an important role here. Also the South and the North, or the rich and the poor, and all these kind of balances. But the context is everything. So I think it's important that we make nuanced recommendations. I think we are going to come up with recommendations, and try to make sure. One thing we can emphasize is that one size does not fit all, and we need to really context all of the measures, all of the recommendations needs to be contextualized based on the age group of the country, based on the geographical distribution. I mean, Sweden and the Netherlands, for instance, we always say Sweden has so much land and they have a dispersed population, whereas the Netherlands is very concentrated. Just an example. So these kind of things, the geographical context and all of the other things play an important role. And I need to also come back to this international system. What we see in that international system is always the struggle. The countries, when it comes to reality, countries ask for support from WHO. And they find the support that WHO provided not enough. Whereas on the other hand, they want to keep their autonomy. So it's always a dance between, and also in the EU system or in the European Union or the WHO, when it comes to member states, it's always a dance, the balance between the autonomy of countries deciding for their own and WHO recommending them. And even in Europe, by the way, I can tell based on my experience because I'm working in EU studies, the countries ask for advice from EU, but they don't want them to go into their internal businesses. I mean, there's always this stance. They want more information, they want more support, they want more advice from WHO, but on the other hand, they want to be free in implementation. So what I see, one thing very much missing from early on the pandemic is that why didn't WHO foresee this age gradient in Africa and recommend about it? they should have contextualized their advice for Africa early on, or all these countries who have, I mean, low-income countries. I'm turning to those countries with median age of 15, 20. They should have recommended differently there, or those climates that are warmer. So they should have done that because many countries of these they don't have the capacity to do that, to contextualize all that information and put it into their context. So I think this is something that can be asked from WHO.
Thank you for this list of policy briefs. I think that's a very good idea. I'm only wondering whether we can structure one or two of these slightly differently. I don't like to place the question of is WHO fit for purpose. I fear that the Trumpian model can overlap with this. I would rather say how do we democratize global health governance? How do we actually increase the voice of both public health and of LMIC nations in the decision-making process of WHO. It includes the institutional structure of WHO, no doubt about it. I mean, absolutely. I don't think it's the content. It's the question of making these more redundant. You know that the developed countries have cut back their mandatory funding to the WHO and made it much more based on bilateral. So their way, they have already placed this question, and their solution is actually goes the wrong way. In some sense, therefore, we need to differentiate. That's one important thing. It's a whole thing about how their funding operates and how they justify their funding by saying WHO is not fit for purpose. So by having bilateral treaties and bilateral funding instead of this funding, we are able to actually direct it. So I think that's one thing. But the other thing is, in the first one, I need to think about this, but what are the lessons of the lockdown for the lessons for the future from what we know of the lockdown is perhaps a better way of placing this. And we need to say in this what we know for certain and the open questions, what we don't know for certain also. These are things we know, we have learnt about lockdowns. These are things we are not certain about lockdowns. And these are things we, somewhere nuanced, and not saying that we know everything, and therefore define the agenda for research. In a particular way, I'm basically saying that it's an agenda for research, but I think there are certain conclusions that we can draw now and certain things that we need to think through.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really helpful. Both of those. I mean, all the comments have been very helpful. But those, in terms of how we, it's a strategy, isn't it? And we've got to be quite political about how we phrase things. And I think both of those comments help us to do that.
I think UNESCO should be there. Yes, they was very inactive against school closure for more than a year. They actually launched a campaign to support online schooling. Learning never stops. You can learn anytime, anywhere. Absolutely. And then 1 year later, they reversed that. Yeah, I would like to say a few things. So, I'm currently consulting for one or two groups to challenge the WHO agenda, including the treaty, the draft treaty. And I understood the question on, WHO funding. I and a few others look into that. I have to say that it's quite transparent. You can look on the website. You can criticize about this and that, but most of the majority of the fund is online. It's very accessible when it comes from non-state actors. This integrated data, and it's also very clear. You can see how much the WHO received from the, each group, like the BMGF, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, etc.
Toby, do you want me to manage this side of the room and you manage that side of the room? Yeah, that's very democratic.
So I just want to start, Andrew, great reflection here. I think you really picked up a couple of really core points, and I've been actually doing this myself. Is I have a list of research activities or policy briefs that I think need to be done, and you've hit on a couple of them really well, right? So different variants of lockdown, and what are the studies on the effectiveness of lockdown, right? There's a big scientific conversation there, but it's very skewed to maximizing effectiveness of these policies, actually. And we're kind of at a point where we need to take a different sort of look at that evidence base. The second one, other options. There's actually no paper right now that's been published saying, bringing those countries together that pursued a different option and presenting the data on those as a group. And I would say it would be more impactful to actually put them as a group together and talk about them as, what could have been, let's say. The comment on WHO and UNICEF, et cetera, I would say we should expand that to encompass all scientific advice. Because we've heard a lot about different government advisory groups or, medical association, the Pediatrics Association in the US, I'm thinking specifically. Like a lot of these groups also dropped the ball in a very substantial way. Or, where was the Royal Society in the UK? Or, exactly. So kind of a broader look, and when I say scientific advice, I mean the whole gamut of social issues, not just modeling, et cetera. And actually, I had started drafting something similar to what we're discussing here, and I had called it 10 lessons. And I think we might want to think about drafting something along those lines out of this conference. That's one proposition. Those papers tend to get a lot of traction, right? 10 lessons from COVID lockdowns for the future, let's say, something along those lines. And last comment is, I do think we need to engage more with how public opinion was formed during the crisis, and that might even be its own sort of group to discuss public opinion formation and sort of the mechanisms that were used to craft public opinion in a specific way. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Mine's just a question. WHO in Latin America, its space is OPS. Is there something like that for Africa and the Middle East, etc.? Okay, they are regional offices. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think my observation really is around sort of this perceived sort of data deficit, in the global South, and mechanisms through which that deficit can be addressed, if at all. Is it that there's no data in Africa, or does it exist in forms that are probably not normal? Is there sort of alternative ways of harvesting that data? So that it's used to sort of influence, policy, because it might be that data sort of does exist. It's just that it exists in a way that we probably don't consider legitimate.
I think we should also look at how public interest groups and special interest groups aligned in different countries. That made such a significant difference in public opinion. What position teachers' unions took, for example, on school closures, really influenced parents' and politicians' perspectives. What position pediatricians and doctors took on the same issue, because we've been following that issue in particular, really mattered in public opinion. They were considered the experts. So it's, they worked as the trustees of public opinion, but in the States, both doctors and teachers were against school closures. Looking at the same evidence in Holland and in Germany, they were against school closures, and in the States, they were for school closures. They were all looking at the same evidence, but public opinion was shaped very locally by these forces more than anything else. And in Germany, for example, the Social Democrats were prioritizing women's employment, and they were talking about school closures from that perspective. They were saying if we close schools, women's careers and employment opportunities will be harmed. We should consider that. And Democrats did not talk about that in the States. So, both are social democratic, left of center parties, supposedly, but they had very different priorities. And we saw that in Turkey, too. What the teachers and doctors said influenced opinion leaders overall in society. And also, we should look at who was trusted by whom. Thomas was our face of the group. Initially, I was a lot, on different platforms. And then people were like, how dare you say open the schools, you're not a doctor, what do you know about anything? I was like, well, I'm not talking about the virus, I'm talking about the political, psychological, whatever, the kids. But no, I had no right to talk about how these would affect education, about children's well-being, about how it would affect employment of women, all those topics that were completely non-medical, because I was not a doctor and this was a medical issue. And what we kept saying was that this is not purely a medical issue. Public health is not just a medical health issue. So who is considered an expert? And I think that was very early on during the pandemic, pretty much in every context, this was pushed that epidemiologists are, who you should turn to for all kinds of expertise on this. But there were the economists talking, political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, philosophers. No one listened to them. And I think if we diversified at least that, who's an expert, it would be a much richer conversation. So yeah, two things. Why? I'm still very curious. I mean, there are a lot of theories, but they go into like speculation. Why was there such a big divergence among similar groups with the same data, looking at the same data in different countries? What happened there? There must have been something political within these organizations, something going on.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my comments, I'll first of all maybe raise a question and then make some suggestion. First of all, my comments to how the WHO and the United Nations reacted. I think they have some governance structure. I mean, they are champions of transparencies. When we work with them, we sign all the conflicts of interest and have everything. So what really happened? Where there's some very strong influence within the structure that's allowed them to do what they did by being used against the people they should protect. WHO, great gatekeeper, working with them over the years, there were a couple of things we came to learn, but there was a great disappointment. That's the group that should hold the gate for you and protect. So was not there. So the governance system is there, due process theoretically. So one of the questions and things we want to really interrogate at this time is to look at that due process. Of course, that again aligns with the treaty on preparedness against the pandemic. What due process we have followed? Because there will be need to interrogate in the formulation. Of course, there were arguments around even the definition of pandemic and its application at that time. And the discussion at that space really was that the definition of pandemic was not really clearly followed for some things that happened at the initial time of the pandemic. Then one of the effects we saw, in some places there was a deafening silence even among professional groups that appeared to be abetting, because silence is golden. So if we want to look at the transparency and professionalism among influencers of public opinion, because we know the press, the media group were just everywhere, the panic and all, the kind of reporting we're talking about, truths and all of those. It'd be good to see how this is, interrogated, the transparency, professionalism among the influencers of public opinion during COVID. Of course, in interrogating that, of course, there are issues that will come out. Because, of course, academic publishers, we saw that really, in the way that some things that were known about what should work or what should do in an emergency when you don't have proven therapies. Well, it's entrenched in the Helsinki Declaration. We are not really followed in the circumstance that we found ourselves. That certain interventions, which ordinarily some rapid study would have been able to resolve, we are not done. All we saw was complete shutdown of all things that should provide hope. So it would be good to interrogate these influencers really across board. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to comment on the issue that evidence can be interpreted in different ways. because that's nothing new. I mean, we've always done that. I was for some time the president of the German Association for Evidence-Based Medicine, and the past 20 years, we founded our organization in 1999. We've been working on conflicts of interest, on medical data, on how studies are interpreted, how studies are manipulated. And it was possible during the past 20 years to discuss this. And with COVID, all of a sudden, it was not allowed to discuss anymore. So I think it is not a problem of a differential interpretation of data. I don't think it is a problem that the experts were only selected epidemiologists and not psychologists, anthropologists, sociologists, and so forth. Even within the medical community, there were only selected experts, and the rest of I'm a doctor. The doctors who were critical, who asked, as our network of evidence-based medicine, we put out a publication on the 20th of March in 2020 asking, where is the evidence? And we sent this to the government. And the only response we got, well, you're not scientific anymore. So I think it was a political problem, and I think that's what we need to address, and we have to talk about how to solve this, because we have to change politics.
I have thoroughly enjoyed the very interdisciplinary and international confrontation on the lockdown policies in so many different areas of the world. And I would really hope that this conversation continues with the same kind of critical discourse and academic rigor, not just on lockdown mandates, but also when it comes to vaccine mandates. I think there is, emotionally speaking, still a lot of hesitancy and even hostility on the topic, which I personally find very interesting, because in my own educational pathway, I've always been very interested whenever something was emotionally a taboo. Why was that the case? And then going into these conversations, I think, are very necessary, because when something is a taboo, there's so much to be discussed about.
Yeah, I actually just remembered when I was going through, to see what the World Bank was doing in Nicaragua for the COVID, or for everything. There were a couple of small grants to do studies on mental health in rural schools and stuff. Anyway, so I will look for that and see if those studies are done, etc. That would be interesting to have as some.
Just a very brief comment for us to help orient this battle of ideas. So if you've had the pleasure of reading Bill Gates' recent book on the pandemic, has anybody read it? Who's read it here? So I have read it, Toby reviewed it. It is an alarming book. I would encourage you all to read it, right? In there, he has one graph about lockdowns where he has the benefit of lockdown, which is up here, and the cost of lockdown, which is down here, okay? So he is his organization is the largest funder of WHO, right? In the book, he says, to stop the global, the future, to better prepare for pandemics and respond to them, we need a global workforce of about 5,000, pandemic experts who can, direct from the control room of where, Seattle and Geneva, the response to the next pandemic. And he is probably going to fund, maybe not 5,000, but a good number of these operators. So we need to orient our work to this audience, which has a lot of power, a lot of money, and they have public opinion as well.
Yes, I'm afraid that for reasons like this, I'm extremely skeptical that all of this lobbying of the WHO or whatever it might be is going to achieve anything. I think as long as we're working in a world where pandemics are seen as problems that have to be solved, we are likely to keep on seeing responses like this. So sorry to be pessimistic. The other thing I would say, which is I'm afraid off-piste from the suggestions that have been made, but nonetheless I'd like to make it, is that, for me, who's someone who doesn't, come from the developing world or particularly study it, it's extraordinarily surprising to hear the same stories from so many different parts of the world about really almost identical responses on paper adopted, in countries as different as Angola to Turkey to Colombia we heard about yesterday. And, the obvious ways in which all these countries are different seem to have had practically no influence on what, at least at the top level, was declared would be the working strategy, even though it's a strategy that, in my humble opinion, made sense nowhere. It's not that it made sense in Holland, but not in Mozambique. It made no sense in Holland, made no sense in Mozambique. But not be that as it may. And it seems to me like there probably won't be a lot of other times in the immediate future when people from so wide a variety of countries are in the same room talking about this, and that if some time could be, I know it's come up, but I feel we haven't got as far as we might have on this, to put into understanding how this uniform global response came about, which I think isn't a question of a single answer, but is a question that probably this group is uniquely qualified to try to answer.
It's just something for all of us to think about. You've probably already noticed how terminology has shifted. So for someone who works in education and international development, everything is now global. There is no international. So if you look at the terminology, but what you lose with the word global is the reference to nations. So not that nation states are anything to be adored or trusted, but there was a role for nations to play. So when we move from the term international to the term global, we are losing something. So when we talk about COVID, lockdowns, or anything else that we've been discussing since yesterday, we should keep track of how terminology has shifted and how the journals in each discipline, for example, from international development or international studies, it's gone to global development. So what are we doing with these things? And why was it deemed necessary to change these terms?
Yeah, well, thank you, and thanks for giving those suggestions such good consideration. Just a few kind of detailed responses. I agree with many of the comments and suggestions made. I think on the treaty, it's a process which is designed to culminate in 2024, I believe. And I imagine that on the way, member states would be doing whatever consultation they need to do at home, as Riva mentioned in the case of India, with potentially a bill in Parliament so that India can sign the treaty. So I think that's probably still to come, and that would be a venue for for resisting aspects of this or the whole thing. The contextualization issue, yes, I think needs to be cross-cutting across everything that we do. It's absolutely fundamental. And the point about advisors needing to contextualize their advice, whether it's WHO or anybody else, is also very fundamental, I think. Sundar's suggestions for formulating the proposed policy briefs differently, I think, are very good, as Toby mentioned. Kevin's suggestion about 10 lessons from COVID-19, I mean, that, as he says, that kind of thing often does get a good amount of attention, and might be a good way to formulate our sort of 10 most critical messages, as we've just been discussing. Just selecting a few more. I mean, we haven't actually, I didn't include the issue about the selection of experts who were listened to and who were featured on the media, and the failure of social scientists to enter those debates and the public discourse, really. And I think was it Alex who suggested that the problem was that only certain selected experts were given time, and it wasn't even particular professions necessarily, it was individuals, and that this is a political problem. I think that's something that we need to reflect on, and likewise with the idea that Bill Gates Foundation is the biggest funder of WHO. Which, and the report on his book sounds extremely scary. I think we need to think very carefully who is the real target of our work. Who do we actually want to influence? Who do we want to get to change the way that they're operating? And it may be that it's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that is the target. I'm not sure. Or it may be a bunch of, I don't know, maybe the way to get to Bill Gates is via another philanthropist who he's in competition with or something. I'm not sure. But I think we need to think about that in a politically savvy way. So I think that's absolutely right.
Very quickly, so on the WHO agenda, there's not only the treaty. I think it's a mistake when we often the treaty, the draft treaty is there, but it's actually quite difficult. The treaty might not pass because it requires a 2/3 of the vote. Whereas there's also the ongoing revision of the international health regulations that will require only a simple majority vote. And that would be very easy to pass. So, I mean, in my view, there are several state and non-state actors are pushing towards, revising the international health regulations to give more power to WHO.
Thank you, Van. And I think that's really important. And in fact, in a way, who we want to influence? Well, some of the people we're trying to influence are the governments of the countries that we've been discussing, so they can vote against some of these issues if they turn out to be, problematic. Any other comments on what's been said?
A comment about Bill Gates and WHO. I didn't know he was a major funder, but we also haven't talked at all anything about COVID and the pharmaceutical companies. So I'm going to send you a name of a book written by somebody I know about why the United States doesn't have a public health system. And it's very interesting because it's a collusion between pharmaceuticals and military years ago, but there might be other partners now. But
Yes, very briefly, just in line with what Madalena said, I would suggest that within one of the categories that Toby proposed, or if they're moved, that some room made specifically for discussing vaccination, because you cannot make sense of the entire COVID strategy without the specific extreme priority given to vaccinating everybody.
The thing I would say in vaccine, there are many alliances working and doing good work, and maybe you need to just add your force within some of those groups which are working, like the People's Vaccine Alliance, the different things that are looking at that. But on lockdowns, there is no group, no network that is working that I know of on this.
Yeah, so this is a question for everyone. How do we make use of the information that we have about conflicts of interest between, say, Reuters CEO and his pharma stock? It's not just one person, right? A lot of the media owners and a lot of people in celebrity kind of like academics, departments leading research in certain areas, there's a lot of funding ties. So the whole issue of conflict of interest has been really it's an open secret. We know about it, but it's not really known to the voting public. I don't think that people know that, even people in my department, for example, might not know that the Reuters CEO has Pfizer stock. So this is this is just one example. But how do we make use of this information to mobilize against the way decisions are taken in a top-down manner by people who have direct stake in this? So that is something that we need to think about. The other thing with vaccines is actually not just the vaccines, but the data, the way data is being collected and how we have health and security agencies now everywhere. They might have different names, but for example, in India, when everyone who got a vaccine certificate, whether they got vaccinated or not, had a health ID generated, and a lot of people did not know. Well, I grew up there, so so the thing is that we need to know what is the purpose for that data. Why is it being generated in a very secretive fashion? Who is storing that data and so on? How is it being linked with other health-related data of private citizens?
On this point, I would really like to understand what is this problem of addressing a taboo in order to avoid to be shut down?
Problem is if you're trying to influence something. It comes back to the question of who we want to influence. There's no point in my view in influencing that section of social media which already has come to particular views around vaccines and COVID. Because they already have that view, and nothing that this group does will change anything. And what we want to do, what the purpose of this event is to try and change something. And I think that for me, that is not going to succeed in changing anything. But therefore, we're better off affecting what we can affect. We haven't talked about vaccines very much at all in this conference, so I don't really see it as a product of the discussion. But
one small reminder about the lockdowns. I think I would recommend not to focus on lockdowns in the in the recommendations we are going to make. I think the title of the conference is very nice, COVID-19 restrictions, because it was not only lockdowns that impacted people's lives. So, and we take a broader perspective to it, and then also going into the definition of lockdown, how it was implemented in different places. That opens a whole another discussion. Contextualize, so that would be one advice from me. And who should be the target? Well, we're going to discuss tomorrow, but perhaps trying to influence the countries, governments, all the way from London to all the countries' governments could be a very long path. Perhaps focusing on scientific community in the short run might be another perspective.
Yes, sorry, I have a professional problem. I should like to correct, or if there were any misunderstanding. Well, if we talk about the budget of the WHO, the BMGF is not is the biggest private funder, yeah, and the biggest contribution comes from Germany, actually. So you have BNO budget, and that is a percentage from of GDP from each country, and then you would have earmark funding, so voluntary funding, and then WHO has about, I would say, 8 to 10% for this current biennium from private, from non-state actors. Yeah.
WHO thing is a long thing that goes back to 1985. There's a history of that. The US froze the funds, then the cess funds were the thing. So currently about 22% of the funds are, 22 to 28% are the cess funds. The thing about cess funds is that WHO has the autonomy to use it according to their priorities. The so-called voluntary funding or philanthropic funding is not such an act of philanthropy. It is actually an act of laying down conditions on what the... So in some sense, you are saying that 70% of the WHO's priority is set by bilaterals. They have actually got to sign on that this is our deliverable and this is what they are going to deliver. Some of them are good, but most of it has to... Therefore, what you choose and what you do not choose to focus on, what you do research on, what you intervene on, is set by them. And there was a redefinition and a big... Therefore, also, like in this whole COVAX thing about vaccine distribution, there was a marginalization of WHO that the WHO has to accept. Gates Foundation gets directly into it. So in some sense, it's also saying that the WHO, you play this technical advisor role, but this overall policy and financing role is with the other organizations on that.
Before any campaign, I think there should be a power analysis identifying the key actors and which one of those we can reach, because all institutions in the end are individuals that need to be convinced. And sometimes you find one person who has the ear of Bill Gates. It's just a stupid example, and then you convince them. You don't change the discourse, but you convince key people, and you never start the conversation by saying you were wrong on lockdowns. I changed my opinion on lockdowns, but I didn't change it because someone told me I was wrong. You know, you need to go with, the language is very important if you want to convince people.
So I'll have the last word, and I'd like to thank Toby for organizing and others who have been organizing this conference. So it's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay, Kevin. Okay.